And welcome to the Bitcoinlens podcast. This is episode 7, and today I'm going to be covering a Bitcoin August 2024 update, just to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of some of the things I'm tracking in the traditional finance markets. As far as Bitcoin technology updates, we'll do a little bit of a global outlook, and then finally we'll also just quickly peek at Bitcoin in politics. So with that being said, if you haven't subscribed yet to my X or Twitter account, it's at BTC. And then depending on where you're watching or listening right now, you can find me on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts just by searching for Bitcoinlens. So let's jump right into this. So first of all, I wanted to look at the traditional finance markets for August and how that kind of affected Bitcoin. And there's a few interesting stories there that I wanted to go over. So first of all, on August 9th, we saw JP Morgan deploying RIAs into the wild. So all this means is they're registered investment advisors. Up until now, they were not allowed to recommend Bitcoin ETFs to their clients. And they could talk about it if they were asked about it, but they weren't allowed to recommend or push this on their clients. So this is something that JP Morgan announced on August 9th. And this will be pretty massive because JP Morgan's got about $1.5 trillion in assets under management. So, if we look at a 3% allocation to Bitcoin ETFs, that would be about $45 billion into Bitcoin ETFs just from JP Morgan. And let's say we fulfill that in $150 million a day. That would take about 300 days to fulfill that 3% allocation, which would ultimately change the Bitcoin price to about $120,000 more than what it is right now today. So that's a pretty significant amount if we just look at that. And that's obviously assuming everything else stays the same and we don't see other sell-offs. But that is pretty big news from JP Morgan there in the financial markets. Then you fast forward to this week, and we actually saw Wells Fargo also deploying their RIAs. So just to kind of put that in perspective, Wells Fargo is the second biggest bank in the world with a $1.7 trillion asset under management holding there. And they just pointed out that they're going to start pitching this to their clients on September 1st. So also same story as JP Morgan. They were allowed to talk about it, but they weren't allowed to recommend this. So their RIAs are now going to be out in the wild and start talking to their clients about this. They're the second biggest, like I said. They're right behind the ICBC, the Chinese bank. And this is pretty massive from a US perspective. So these are two big banks just in August that have announced this for RIA Bitcoin ETF recommendations via the RIAs. And if you consider all the other banks that haven't even jumped on this ship yet, this is really just going to be like a domino effect right now. If you see two of the biggest players in the field right now recommending this to their clients, I can just imagine all the other ones, BlackRock, Fidelity, and all the other big ones are going to just follow suit here. So another thing, this is a little bit different. This is a little bit off the RIA topic, but August marks a very significant month for Bitcoin in that it is the 1-year anniversary of the ETF and the US court ruling on ETF rejections. So the SEC basically rejecting ETFs until a year ago, and a US court ruled that this was not legal, and therefore the ETFs got approved. That started trickling in since January this year. So very, very big marker there. 1-year anniversary. I thought I'd give that a little shout out here in August 2024. And since January, we've now obviously accumulated 11 US ETFs, which is massive for the Bitcoin industry, for the TradFi industry, for exposing baby boomers to, Bitcoin, just as a unit of account and also just as a investment. So almost 800,000 Bitcoin has been gobbled up by these 11 ETFs since January. So just to kind of show you how significant that is and what big a part that played in, the price action here in the last year or so, or last 7-8 months or so. Now, another big thing in the financial markets is ICBC. So, this is the biggest bank in the world. Like I mentioned earlier, they're bigger than Wells Fargo and they have a $7 trillion assets under management. So, biggest bank in the world. And they came out not too long ago, in the last few weeks, and they said Bitcoin is a better investment than gold. And I will quote directly what they said. So, ICBC said that Bitcoin has managed to retain a scarcity similar to gold, though its mathematical consensus mechanism. The flagship crypto has resolved issues related to divisibility, authenticity, verification, and portability. So the report also added that despite Bitcoin's waning monetary attributes, its status as an asset is solidifying. So some really big news there from basically the biggest bank on earth, ICBC, $7 trillion asset under management there. And this also happened very recently here in the last few weeks. Now, to kind of go a little bit back, rewind a little bit back to kind of the fiat status, we just saw Goldman Sachs come out this month as well, and they said they're predicting that GDP predictions for 2050, we're going to have China number one at $58 trillion, India at $44 trillion, the United States at 34, Indonesia at 10.5 trillion, and Brazil at 7.5 trillion. I say that just for you to know that three out of that top five there is actually BRICS nations. So they're part of the BRICS Economic Alliance. And like I mentioned in a previous podcast, they were going to announce their new currency in October, which makes this even more interesting. And why this is important also is, like I said, the threat to the US dollar. I definitely recommend you go check out that podcast I had, My Concerns with the US Dollar in 2024. And I go over a lot of those things. But in a nutshell, I'm very concerned about BRICS forming and their economic alliance and their high input, and as well as the threat to the US dollar as global reserve currency. So, highly recommend checking that out. But I thought that was a pretty interesting prediction there. Like I just said, three out of the top five, going to have the highest GDPs in the world, and four out of the top six, if you include number six there, which is Russia, and they're also part of BRICS. So that is really the traditional finance update for August. Now, moving on to the technology updates. So there's some technology changes, of course, always in Bitcoin and really on the layer two to make things more efficient. I've talked about this in previous podcasts as far as like, how do we make payments a little bit faster, transactions a little bit cheaper, and we've seen a nice update there from Lightspark. So Lightspark, they launched Lightspark Extend, which allows businesses instant Lightning payments. It's instant and it's low fees. And I believe like a few weeks ago, they announced you can transfer like $10,000 from Coinbase for a very, very minimal fee, and it's instant. So these are basically UMA powered payments, and UMA is basically like an email address, but for money. And you can send any crypto on a 24/7 through a wallet, an exchange, a bank. The global adoption of this is pretty wide. The UMA global adoption, and Lightspark integrates with Lightning and UNA enabled wallets. So big Bitcoin technology update there, just making it more efficient, making it faster, and lower fees on that layer two. So moving on to the global outlook. So I don't know if you've noticed, but El Salvador, they've been very pro Bitcoin year for at least the last 4 years or so, since Nayib Bukele took office. And he was actually on the cover of Time magazine this month. So big month for Nayib Bukele. And many in the Bitcoin community, they call him the Bitcoin president because he's pro Bitcoin. He deployed Bitcoin to every single citizen. And he's also using Bitcoin and buying one Bitcoin every single day for their strategic reserve asset. So they also adopted Bitcoin as legal tender. And, El Salvador is really just setting the pace on Bitcoin adoption and how governments can employ this to get them out of the debt cycle and get them out of the the holdings of the IMF. So he also, for other reasons, he was also in the Time magazine. For instance, he got rid of 81,000 gang members since his presidency, and so he's a pretty impressive guy. And really, from a Bitcoin perspective, there's not many better leaders in the world than Nayib Bukele, as far as being Bitcoin first. So they do also have a big Bitcoin conference if you're interested in El Salvador. If you wanted to go check it out, it's at Bitcoin Beach, and that one is, I believe, is hosted in November, so middle to late November. It's the Adopt Bitcoin conference. So really nice one to check out there if you wanted to see Bitcoin community and kind of get in touch with the Bitcoin community, and also see how they've kind of implemented Bitcoin into their market there, and how all the vendors start accepting Bitcoin and trade with Bitcoin, etc. So really interesting stuff there. Moving on the global front, looking at Dubai. So a Dubai court signed legislation this week, actually, which recognizes Bitcoin as a valid form of a salary payment. So you can now accept your salary there. There's not going to be any additional taxes for that transfer and payment, which, in many countries that would be the case had you accepted Bitcoin for salary. You're obviously still going to have your, in traditional countries, you would still have your income tax. Now in Dubai, you're not going to have income tax. But I thought that was pretty neat that Dubai implemented that now, where employers can now pay their employees via Bitcoin. So great move there in Dubai. And nice to see countries adopting Bitcoin as a form of payment there for salary. So Russia as well, interesting stuff. So they allowing crypto payments now for international trade. So they've obviously been squeezed a little bit with sanctions here over the last, couple of years, especially since the Ukraine war. And, this is basically for them to counter all these sanctions. And this law will go into effect on September 1st. So interesting stuff there from Russia, and this is going to be good for the Bitcoin industry, because you're going to see way more payments for foreign trade, and trade that was traditionally done in the US dollar, euro, etc. Since we know most of the Swift transactions, that's basically the global payment, is essentially a messaging platform. It's not, you're not actually transferring money, but it's just changing balance sheets with the Swift messaging system. And most of that trade is done within US dollar and euros. So just to also give you an idea, Russia has lost about 8% of their imports. So 8% decline in their imports as of Q2 2024 due to all these sanctions. So that's kind of why they're moving to being more pro crypto and Bitcoin for international trade. And also, like I mentioned earlier, the BRICS currency is incoming, and they're going to announce their BRICS related currency in October at the BRICS summit in Moscow. So that should be interesting. Definitely keeping my eyes on that one. Moving on to China. So there is talk of China doing a mining unban, or a lift of the mining ban that they implemented in 2021. So they banned mining and crypto in 2021, but of course, these countries are trying to become more creative. I think they can see the writing on the wall. They can see kind of the US leaning more Bitcoin and crypto here in the last, especially in the last 6 months, especially Bitcoin. We're looking at the Bitcoin conference with Trump and RFK both coming there. So I think you're going to see China also be a little bit more pro Bitcoin than they historically have been. And that's a great thing for all of us, right? More adoption, and that's really going to make a surge in the price, and that's really going to fast track us to that global monetary system of Bitcoin, or at least a huge presence in the global monetary system. Now, finally, I just quickly wanted to give a shout out to Africa as well. I just recently read there's over 100 registered Bitcoin businesses in Africa as of Q3 2024. Some of the noticeable countries I saw there was Ghana, South Africa, Senegal, Cameroon, Congo, and all these countries are getting really creative and becoming really savvy in coming up with different Bitcoin ideas and different ways to come up with applications and turn those into businesses. So really, really good, interesting one there for Africa. And one particularly that I saw that kind of piqued my interest that I saw recently was Air BTC. So this is a company out of Cape Town. South Africa. And what makes this one interesting is it's basically like Airbnb, but they accept all payments in Bitcoin only. So it's like an Airbnb for Bitcoiners. And if you strictly want to, buy a place or rent a place anywhere in the world, I believe right now they're in Africa mostly, but I think there's a few in Florida. When I was looking at the website a few weeks ago, but that was an interesting one as well. AirBTC, which basically mimics Airbnb, but just for Bitcoiners. So really interesting one there from them. Now, Bitcoin and politics. Just the last point I wanted to make before we wrap up here. So obviously, big one in August was RFK endorsing Donald Trump. So why is this big for Bitcoin? RFK has been one of the OGs when it comes to US politicians, and he's been in Bitcoin for a long time now, actually. I think it was at least 5-6 years now. And not only is he a big proponent of it, but he's also stacking Bitcoin every month, every year. And he's a big believer in the value of Bitcoin and how it solves the problems of this broken monetary system we have, and this broken fiat system. So you look at Donald Trump right now, he's got a lot of Bitcoiners around him, Vivek Ramaswamy, JD Vance, RFK, and a bunch of others, as well as, at the Bitcoin conference, there was also a lot of folks who really try to orange pill him. And it looks like it's working because he's saying all the right things. And he's not just saying it in a superficial way. He's really talking about some specifics of the things that it implement. For instance, the strategic reserve asset, and start stacking there, working very closely with Cynthia Loomis. And they really want to deploy a lot of Bitcoin, and all the Bitcoin seized from criminal activity, for instance, they're not going to sell that for inferior fiat. They're just going to stack that into the strategic reserve as a strategic reserve asset. So I thought that was a real promising RFK for many other reasons outside of Bitcoin as well. But Bitcoiners, I can tell you, they're really going to love this. And that's pretty much, as far as a Bitcoin vote, that's pretty much going to seal the deal for Trump, I would imagine, with RFK being like the Bitcoin OG. Even if you don't believe Donald Trump being a true Bitcoiner, you can't dispute that RFK has been a Bitcoiner now for over half a decade, and he's been talking that talk now for a very long time. So I thought that was really interesting. But that is pretty much all I have for the August Bitcoin update. Those are some interesting ones I saw. Hope that was insightful for you. Thank you for listening or watching. If you're watching this on YouTube, remember to subscribe to me on X, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. You can find me anywhere there. On X, I'm at EmilBTC. I'll see you all for the next episode. Thank you so much. Talk later.